I'm excited to announce that registration is now open for the Colson Center National Conference happening May 19th through the 21st, 2023 in Indianapolis. Secure your spot at the lowest possible price by registering before January 1st at colsonconference.org. This year's theme is Earth Crammed with Heaven, an invitation to encounter God in His mighty works. Join speakers like Justin Bailey, Ryan Baumberger, Dr. Kristen Collier, and many more as we explore glories often referenced but rarely explored, the truths and beauties that claim our wonder and demand our protection. God has filled His creation with His presence. He has blessed His world with His glory. The Colson Center National Conference is an invitation to see God as He has made Himself known and to encounter Him and His mighty works. Register now at colsonconference.org. Welcome to Upstream, where we make your worldview bigger and older by taking hard questions to the headsprings of Christian wisdom. I'm Shane Morris. Why does Christmas inspire so many stories about moral or spiritual reformation? Personal metanoia moments, if you will, that have little to do directly with the birth of Jesus. I think of Scrooge from A Christmas Carol, Dr. Seuss's How the Grinch Stole Christmas, George Bailey from It's a Wonderful Life, Kevin McAllister from Home Alone, Aaron from The Little Drummer Boy, the Herdmans in Barbara Robinson's The Greatest Christmas Pageant Ever, Buddy's dad from Elf. There are just so many examples. And in each case, the character arc is so similar. Hate to love, despair to gratitude, greed to generosity, indifference to tenderness, hearts being opened, broken, warmed, and growing 3 sizes. When did this trend start? Why are we so drawn to such stories? What's the theological connection? Why Christmas? Well, today I want to consider that question. To do that, I've invited someone who's done a lot of writing, speaking, and thinking about the power of stories. Jessica Hooten-Wilson is an award-winning author and scholar of liberal arts at Pepperdine University. She's written several books, most recently The Scandal of Holiness, Renewing Your Imagination in the Company of Literary Saints. She also wrote Giving the Devil His Due, Flannery O'Connor and the Brothers Karamazov, and currently serves as a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum. Jessica Hooten-Wilson, welcome to Upstream.
Thank you so much. I look forward to this conversation.
Well, I actually heard your conversation with Sarah and Aaron on the Colson Center's Strong Women podcast, and I knew I had to get you on here for this special Christmas episode. So let's start here. What makes a good story, in your opinion? You've written a lot about some of the great works of literature of the 20th century. What is the distinguishing mark of a good or effective story in your thinking?
I'm going to be a little cliche to start with truth and beauty and goodness, but I do think that that's the marks of a good story. And I think that all of those things give us glimpses of the source of truth, the source of goodness, and the source of beauty. So when we're looking at great stories, are they telling the truth about the world? That doesn't mean that they have to tell the verifiable empirical truth about the world. They have to tell the truth about what the world is and how it works. For instance, you can't say that all good characters end up with millions of dollars and Prince Charming and happily ever after. That's not necessarily telling the truth about the way the world is. It's more truthful to say that sin happens and suffering happens. And when people are good in the face of it, sometimes they get hurt because they're vulnerable to that. Sometimes they overcome. Sometimes there's redemption, right? And so getting to tell the truth about the world, but then also in a beautiful way that reminds us that we are made for more than this life, that the ugliness and the fallenness and the sinfulness and the hurting is not the end of the story. The story is going to have an ultimately eternally happy ending, and that's the most beautiful truth that we can relay to people.
So in many ways, a good story has this character arc where there's a change, right? There's a development. The character learns something, the character grows. I mean, we could look at, an example as banal as Star Wars and say, yes, there's character, well, at least the older ones, not the new ones, but there's real character development, right? That happens with the heroes and heroines there. They're not the same at the end of the story as they were at the beginning. So I want to distinguish that kind of generic character development that you see in stories, well-written stories, from something that I think I see in stuff that we associate with Christmas. So, and I call it this moral metanoia that happens where a hard or bitter or small heart becomes big, becomes broken, becomes soft, opens up for the first time. And metanoia is simply the biblical Greek term for repentance. It means this about face, this full reversal. I'm wondering if you have noticed the same common thread that I'm talking about in some of these Christmas stories. And if so, what do you think's behind it?
I do think that there is a change in people when they encounter truth and goodness and beauty. And so when you look at these Christmas stories, underlying all of them, at least going back as far as the true Christmas story, is a revelation of something that's different, right? So the fallenness that I was talking about earlier, the sinfulness, or if there's characters that are fallen or his heart was simply too small, in the case of some Christmas stories, you have a breaking in which the divine becomes incarnate. And that revelation in the first Christmas story, I think, underlies all these other revelations. And it comes up in new forms and new ways, even in secular stories, even in people who purport not to believe in the Christian narrative, because the Christmas story really at its root has that kind of breaking in and changing that can happen. And so, yeah, I think you're right. You see that in the best Christmas stories that we have. The best Christmas films are all about that change, that breaking in, that revelation.
What's so interesting about these is that very few of them explicitly mention Jesus, even though there does seem to be it's Christmas, so it's grounded in Christ himself, but very few of them seem to present the child in the manger and say, yes, this is the reason why this character has changed. I mean, certainly some of the examples I cited, the mentions of Christ are oblique at best. I mean, I guess the most obvious exception would be the best Christmas pageant ever, which hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about. But in that one, Jesus is explicitly portrayed in a Christmas pageant. But other than that, he's kind of on the side. Nevertheless, this moral reversal, this metanoia, happens in a way that corresponds to the story of Christianity and what Christ brought into the world. I found that really interesting. I think it also corresponds in really subtle ways to just the way the world itself works. So December is the darkest month, but it's also the month when the light begins to increase. So you hit the winter solstice and there's the darkest night of the year, longest night, and then it reverses and the light begins to increase. There's a literal astronomical about face or reversal that happens. It's kind of like repentance is written into the cycle of the seasons. But that's just a couple of my thoughts on the subtle correspondences. What do you think inspires all of these stories on those like subtle levels? So Jesus, obviously, and then good stories, obviously. But is there anything else that you see at work as we look at the common thread between them all?
I think it's written into the nature of the world. So if a story is going to be good, right, as I mentioned, it's going to tell the story of the world truthfully. And if you have God, the creator, writing his very story into creation, then when you're telling these true stories and you're really going after that when it comes to Christmas, you're going to implicitly tell the story of good news. It's just going to be there. So if people have the story, for example, of what Christmas is, of the joy of the season, or the hope that it brings, or the fact that we use Christmas trees, which are green because it symbolizes evergreen, ever hopefulness, eternal growth, as you mentioned, like in darkness. It's the tree that continues to have life in the midst when all the other trees' leaves have fallen away. And so there's these implicit ways that creation is branded with the very story of who Jesus is that you can't get away from if you're going to tell a Christmas story. You can't tell who Santa Claus is without implying St. Nicholas in the story, the reality of a man who gave away everything, who risked his life for other people, who loved children and said, come to me just like Christ did. So there's all these implicit things that are just kind of written into the characters that you would try to use if you told a Christmas story.
So let's talk about a few of the specific examples I mentioned earlier, because I love what you just said there. The OG, seems to be A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. And you spoke with Sarah and Aaron about this absolute masterpiece that is beloved by millions and has been adapted seemingly millions of times. to various degrees of success, I might add, though I'm partial to the Muppets and the Robert Zemeckis versions. The Patrick Stewart one's pretty good too. But so let's talk about that one. Where did A Christmas Carol come from? Why did Dickens write it, and what was he trying to do?
Well, as I mentioned with Sarah and Aaron, he actually had just done a tour in America, and I think that's important for seeing what inspired him. And Charles Dickens, the man, was always inspired by the Gospels, and he wanted to make the Gospels come to life in essentially social justice, like what we would call social justice now, where he had a real social aspect to writing his fiction. So his stories were all about how the upper class had too much power and too much money, and the lower class had nothing. And that we needed to switch the order of that he was going to follow the Sermon on the Mount and just inversing that. And so when he got to America, he was hoping this idea of democracy and equality would show that there was no British upper class and lower class anymore. And he just didn't see that. He saw there were different forms of it in America, where you still had people with money and power on top, and you still had people without money and power at the bottom. And so he writes this story that is supposed to speak into because he sees it then as a universal problem, that it comes from a sin nature, and that when Jesus is talking about having to reverse that order, it's just to all people. It's not just to the Brits. And so he goes back and writes this story in which a man has to be part of the process of reversing that order. He has to first see that the problem is with himself in order for any change to be made.
I love that background. I didn't even know the thing about Dickens visiting America and being disappointed or disillusioned by the greed, the prevalence of greed that he saw there. That's really crucial, because obviously Christmas Carol this always gets cut out from the adaptations, but there's a ton of social commentary in there that like even one of my favorite mysterious or enigmatic scenes with the end of Scrooge's time with the ghost of Christmas Present. These two children show up, and their names are Ignorance and Want, and they're like clinging to the ghost's robes or hiding beneath them. And he says, "Beware them both." And it's not really explained exactly what's going on, but I do love, there are several adaptations of this, but one that really resonated with me was the Robert Zemeckis one, which was Jim Carrey, right? It's Disney. It has this kind of odd, uncanny valley animation, but it happens to be one of the most accurate adaptations of the story. In that one, the children transform into like various underclass figures. So like a criminal who's like swiping at Scrooge with a knife, and then the girl transforms into like a prostitute, and then she gets put in an insane asylum with a straitjacket, and they throw his words back at him. They're like, he's like, do they have nowhere to go? And in the book, the ghost says this, but they say it in this version where they say, "Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?" And that's like pure social commentary. And we kind of miss that when we're, watching the Muppets version or something, because that would scare the kids.
Right.
As great as Michael Caine was and as scary as he was. But that aspect of like marrying the law or moral imperatives of Christianity to the story of redemption is very interesting. It seems like Dickens was trying to keep us from forgetting that.
I think even more, you're exactly right, but I think he's saying it's the embodiment. So even having these allegorical figures that are kind of embodied in the children in Ignorance and Want, what is the incarnation? It's the embodiment of the word. So the moral imperatives that are called the 10 words in the 10 Commandments, right, in the Old Testament, those 10 words then become a body of Jesus Christ, who walks and shows us what living those 10 words looks like. What does it look like to live out the 10 Commandments? It's a life. It's a story. It's Jesus Christ's story. And so what Dickens is trying to do by imitating writing a story the way that the Gospels are a story is to say, what does it look like if we are ruled by greed and our passions versus what does it look like to be in the 10 Commandments, to be living and walking the way of Jesus? How do I embody that in the characters that I show you that you can experience yourself when you watch these adaptations or when you read these stories?
I have this theory that Dickens may have gotten the inspiration or drawn part of the inspiration for A Christmas Carol from Jesus' parable of the rich man and Lazarus. So if you remember, in the parable, the rich man says, "Send someone to warn my brothers because they don't know they're coming to this place. They're going to be judged." And Abraham says they have Moses and the prophets, let them listen to them. And he says, but no, if someone goes to them from the dead, then they'll listen. And, Jesus speaking through Abraham says, if they don't listen to Moses and prophets, neither will they believe if someone returns from the dead. And that's kind of a, foreshadowing of Jesus himself and his rejection by his people. But I also can't help but think maybe Dickens was like, but wait, what if someone did go back from the dead? And what if they did warn their, brother/business partner of the destiny that he had? And that's exactly Jacob Marley, right? Jacob Marley is the rich man, and he comes to warn the other rich man. What does he say? There's still a chance and a hope of my procuring that you can, avoid my fate. And I think that's so cool, but maybe I'm just making up the connection of, thin air.
The story of Luke is exactly what Dickens is drawing from, is he's retelling by having a man come back from the dead and help the rich man Lazarus find his way back to Jesus. Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
I want to, before we leave A Christmas Carol, I want to ask what the deal is with ghosts. So there's these personifications of past, present, future, and they're dealing with a man's very life, right? It's his own past, present, future. It's Scrooge's own past, present, future. And I've even heard it said that A Christmas Carol is a ghost story before it's a Christmas story. It's supposed to be, spooky. That was Dickens' intent. And you said something to that effect on the podcast as well. What's going on there? And are there broader implications for Christmas itself? Because a friend of mine said recently that Christmas has a good spookiness about it. And I liked that summary.
That's great. Oh, that's a good phrase. No, that's exactly right. I think what is easy to overlook when we are seeing all the twinkling lights and the stars and the baby in the manger is to remember, why was the baby born? The baby is born because we as human beings let death into the world. So this baby has to suffer the consequences. So when Jesus is born, he's born to die. He's a sacrifice being born. He's an altar lamb being born. And that's hard to look at a baby and realize this baby is being born to die, and I am responsible for the reason it will not get to live forever, right? Which, of course, then, because of God's grace, he makes himself live forever and raises himself from the dead, and thus raises all of us from the death. But I think we have to first dwell on that memento mori, that we are going to die because of our own sin. And this baby is going to die for us, so that that's not the end of that story. So there is a haunting, there is this recognition of death, but then also an afterlife that is part of the Christmas reality.
So let's move on to one of the other just sort of beloved, and it's become timeless, stories of moral metanoia or reformation that takes place at Christmas, and that is It's a Wonderful Life, which is just interesting on so many levels, as a film, as a piece of culture, the commentary that it gives on what it means to live a significant life. But it seems to become more meaningful to me every year. The older I get, the more responsibilities that fall on me in life. I can deeply sympathize with George Bailey. Now, Claire Coffey wrote this piece at the Bulwark just recently. Maybe you've seen it. And it's about the so-called Mary problem in It's a Wonderful Life. Mary referring to George's wife, not Mary, the mother of Jesus.
Right, not the Virgin Mary. Right.
Right. But she makes this observation at the beginning. Her argument's fascinating, and you should go check that out. We'll link to it in the show notes. But she makes this observation at the very beginning. She says, like all the greatest Christmas literature, It's a Wonderful Life has an undercurrent of darkness to it. Like A Christmas Carol or A Charlie Brown Christmas, it deals with the death of human hopes as much as their renewal. And most importantly, its emotional punch grows, not diminishes, with rewatching over the years. Jessica, what's your take on how It's a Wonderful Life fits in with this theme of moral, spiritual reformation? Because George Bailey's not a bad guy like Scrooge. He's a good guy, but he ends up in despair.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I was speaking with someone recently, and I hope I can get this. I hope I can say it right the first time. But when you believe in God's greatness without recognizing your own sinfulness, right, it leads to kind of a false form of hope. When you believe in your own sinfulness without recognition of God's goodness and power, that leads to despair. So you need the combination of both your own sinfulness, the darkness, the suffering, the reality of death and how you deserve it, with the ability to understand that God is great and good and will redeem you and resurrect you. And if you don't have both of those things together, then it's either that false piety or it's that despair. And I think that's what we see with George Bailey, is that he has forgotten the grace. That's why the angel actually descends. Like the news that Bailey needs is not a reminder of how horrible he is, which is what Scrooge needed, right? Scrooge needed to know you are a horrible person and we can show you past, present, and future. You're horrible all the way through, right? In the New Spirited musical, right, they call him an unredeemable. Like it's someone who doesn't even seem to be possible to be redeemed. On the opposite side of that, with Bailey, you have someone who's so good but has forgotten why he's so good and what it is so good about his life, and can only see the dark and the overwhelming problems of the world and the things that feel like he's not in control of them. And he forgot you never really were in control. There was always angels among you. There were always gifts and graces coming from above. There was always that, and there still always will be, right? It's not dependent just on you.
Yeah. I think it was last year I noticed for the first time just the imagery at the end of all the people gathering together. And Mary had brought them together, to provide for the Bailey's needs instead of just the building and loans needs for a change. And the imagery there is of, it's like a great harvest. So he's been planting for his whole life in Bedford Falls. And then at some point, the harvest arrives. And all those people and their lives and their families and their home, it's symbolized as homes, right? Because he's runs a building and loan that his dad started. But all those people are the fruits of that long, arduous sowing that he and his family have done. And that's a very interesting, and touching observation, because I know a lot of people who are willing and eager to just give. But remember in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says that your Father in heaven knows that you need clothing and food and a place to live and, stuff like that, earthly needs, and that he'll give them to you if you just seek the kingdom of heaven, or all these things will be added to you. And it's easy for us to forget that God cares about our earthly needs. But to me, as a father and a husband, knowing that God sees those things and cares about them and has a way of providing for them in almost miraculous ways helps me to want to soften my heart. It helps me to want to have hope. It helps me to not want to, metaphorically walk out on that bridge and just be like, what good is it all? What am I doing? I haven't succeeded like this person or that person. And that's powerful to me, because you don't have to be a bad guy to get there, to get to that point of needing real moral reformation. But God is tender toward us. He doesn't require us to morally reform without some kind of, provision for our needs.
Well, and you were talking about how, I can't remember her name, you said from the Bulwark, who wrote that piece that we need to see this story over and over again.
Yeah, Claire Coffey, not to be confused with the actress.
Okay. So Claire Coffey was saying it repeats over and over again. So Dickens' Christmas Carol, the reason he calls it a Christmas Carol, because it's kind of a strange title, is because like a carol, it has a refrain that you want to listen to it again and again. And it's the same with It's a Wonderful Life. There's the necessity of you're going to forget again by next year that your life is valuable and that you don't have to be successful and that you don't need to be a potter in order to be on top of the world. That instead, right, you can be George Bailey, and that's the way that life is still good. And you need those reminders every single year. That's why we have the beauty of this season, because we have to constantly be reminded of those truths.
Yeah, and that really corresponds with the giving too. The symbolic, as corny as it can be, like the symbolic giving of gifts, the other-centeredness, the reforming, rebonding of those relationships, and just being like, you know what, I care about you, and I'm going to give you this little doodad to signify how much I care about you, or something. Maybe you're better at giving gifts than I am. I really, really stink at it.
Well, you were saying, God provides for you, that God will provide miraculously sometimes. The Christmas season is supposed to be a reminder that the way that God provides is through us, that we are the hands and feet, right? And so if giving is going to continue, we're responsible for it. We need to be giving to those people who need provisions, who are praying, Lord, please provide the paycheck so I don't get kicked out of my apartment, or please provide the groceries, or please provide a gift for my kids under the Christmas tree. Like we are the hands and feet, and we're supposed to be giving miraculously for people. That's what Christmas is about.
One of the common themes that I see in a lot of these stories is the despairing setup. So what I mean by that is most of the story, in the case of It's a Wonderful Life, is spent establishing just how despairing this guy is and all the good reasons he has for despair. I mean, you get to that point where he's, saying, I'm at the end of my rope. I don't know what to do. And you really feel it. I mean, you feel like this guy has been beaten down endlessly. He's tried and he's tried and he's tried. He just keeps getting these unearned hits. He doesn't deserve to take the fall for his business partner losing the money. He doesn't deserve to deal with the results of the depression in Bedford Falls. He doesn't deserve to lose his honeymoon money, to help keep people propped up. It just happens again and again and again. And it just sets you up to really sympathize with and feel his pain. And then on another story, like A Christmas Carol, Dickens establishes pretty forcefully and early that Ebenezer Scrooge is a hardened human being. I mean, he is as hard as it gets. He's skinflint, as I love that word. He's callous toward the fate and even lives of his fellow human beings, just telling him, they should die and decrease the surplus population. Everyone's just shocked at his hardness. And then there's the reversal that happens becomes that much more meaningful as a result. I guess the question I'm driving at is, what is the motive for this setup? And how do we come to see that at work in our own lives, where the people that we think are beyond help, you mentioned that a second ago, that some people are just beyond help, that they actually are redeemable, that the irredeemables are redeemable. Give me your thoughts on that, because I love the setup, the hopeless setup.
Yeah, I think this is where stories are telling the truth for at least a couple of reasons. One, every single person is in process. So George Bailey all the way up until the end. I mean, until you die, you don't know how your story ends, and there's always hope. That's why stories can tell the truth. That's why there can be a moral metanoia, because nobody is finished. Everyone is in process, right? And that's the truth. The second part is, if you look at scriptures and what they reveal to us about who God is and who we are as people, the reality is the Old Testament is not filled with a bunch of heroes. The entire Old Testament is a story of people being faithless over and over and over and over and over again. And so when you read the Old Testament, you're like, how can God still love them? How can he keep bringing them back? Why is he still choosing these people above all other people? And it has everything to do with God and nothing to do with us, right? Because we're so faithless. So I think that that's what these stories are doing, is they're imitating the great story by saying we're all in process and we look very unredeemable. All of us ourselves, we should see ourselves in Scrooge and not cast him out as though that's somebody else that's unredeemable. It's actually always us that we should be seeing in those characters.
That brings up another theme that I think is interesting and worth noting. So all of these characters have an element of victimhood to them. So there's even Scrooge, and this is what you see when you go back with the Ghost of Christmas Past, and you see his background, and you see what happened to him, and that he didn't start out as a skinflint, right? He didn't start out as Ebenezer Scrooge. He started out as, a guy who had hopes and dreams and even a fiance. That circumstances played a role in driving them to the place where they went. So you've got moral agency on the one hand, like you made wrong decisions, you sinned, you abused the people around you, you exploited them, you chose to become a wicked person who needs redemption. But on another level, the circumstances did lead you to some extent there. And It's a Wonderful Life, you certainly see this. And then you see it in even more like, kind of goofy, kid-friendly examples, like How the Grinch Stole Christmas. I actually really like the Jim Carrey adaptation of that from like 1999 or 2000, because it gives the Grinch a backstory, and you get a sense for, without excusing him for being the way he is, you get a sense for why he is the way he is and why he hates Christmas. And I think that's fine, because it parallels what Dickens does with Scrooge, where it gives you a reason why he became the way he did, why money became everything for him. And then you see that again and again in all these, like Kevin McAllister. We wanted to talk about Home Alone. There's a reason why he hates his family and wants them gone. It's because they actually are kind of awful, right? They forget about him. They bully him. They call him a little jerk and stuff like that. And in the greatest Christmas pageant ever, the Herdmans are the way they are because they're from a broken home and they don't have any money. So it's like, there are circumstances. How can these, extenuating circumstances help us to better see the irredeemables as redeemable?
Yeah, I think it's a both and here. So I'm going to be a little bit of a theologian on this, but we look at the original Grinch book, and the narrator says, we have no idea why the Grinch is the way he is. Perhaps it just was the, most likely reason of all is that his heart was 3 sizes too small. And so at the end of the day, we don't have a reason. And if you look at like other films, like the Batman series, you have the Joker is just evil because he's evil. And he makes up all these stories and none of them are true. There's no reason he's evil. He's just evil because evil just takes away. That's just part of the nature of evil, is to be detracting. And so I think it's a both and. I think that there's both evil, in which it's just going to parasitically play on people and it's going to take away their being until they end up hardened and Scrooge-like or Joker-ish or whatever it looks like. On the other side, evil can also cause so many problems, like poverty, like injustice, like situations, that it's very difficult to be good. So Aristotle used to say that no person could be expected to be moral. And in other words, no person could be happy unless they had a good home and money and friends. And these are impossible things to have if you don't have the basics laid out for you. So how could you expect, there's some theories that how could you expect anybody to ever be good if they don't have any money? If they're stuck with no choices but to be bad, to steal, to murder, to get their way, to prostitute themselves, you've left them without options, you've left them without choices. So I think it's both and in these stories, and they're trying to show us the reality that it just always is the case, that it could be both and.
Yeah, I like that. Dickens seemed to lean especially hard in that direction, to where, and you see this in his other stories as well, that the whole idea of a life of what the powerful people would call crime is often just a response to material lack. And in A Christmas Carol, of course, Scrooge just has no pity for the people who are in the underclass at the bottom of society in the streets, but those people are often precisely the ones that he's put there through being such a greedy guy.
I think then what you see in kind of the modern adaptations of this is the Scrooges are actually horrible because they have everything. So we see this switch. For example, I just watched the Spirited musical. That's why it's in my head. But in the Spirited musical, you have this guy who has everything, right? Like a whole wall of his apartment is all glass, which is always a sign of wealth in New York, right? And he has all the money he possibly needs, which means he has all the power. And that makes him a bad person. He's a bad person because he has all this stuff. So he never has to be good to people. He never has to be kind to people. He doesn't have to care about people. He can dehumanize them because he's so wealthy. So we've kind of switched the narrative and the way that we look at it now in America in the 21st century. If you're powerful and rich and famous, you have no choice but to be bad. And if anybody was put in the situation where they were rich and famous, they too would become bad people because that's what money and wealth and fame does to you.
And yet Scrooge illustrates an alternative to that, because in learning how to keep Christmas, right, in honoring the past, present, future, all the vows he makes on his sort of Reformation morning, he immediately starts to bless people with his wealth. And the funny implication to that is, and I never exactly understood, maybe what Dickens is doing here, because the ghost of Christmas to come shows him his own tombstone. And it's like, he's not saying, oh, you're going to die if you don't be good, but if you be good, you're not going to die. Like, he's still going to die. But the implication with the Mrs. Dilber and everything, when he sees her like pawning off his stuff, is that he's going to die alone, and he's going to die in the spiritual circumstances that he's in. And possibly, and I don't know if this is true, but possibly his clock has been reset a little bit. Like, he has more time than he would have otherwise, precisely because he starts to bless people and he wants to give the Cratchits a good Christmas. And, and then Tiny Tim, same thing. Like, what happens? Tiny Tim lives because Scrooge has shared the wealth. Like, he's shared what he has, and in doing so, has himself become blessed.
Yeah. Or in the case of George Bailey, it's all the poor people in town who give the very little they have back to George that helps him come out of his situation. So they're the powerless in town who fight the powerful Mr. Potter by giving even the meager amount that they have in order to help him. I think that's a beautiful way of recognizing that it's not just one thing. It's not poverty or riches either way that makes you a horrible person. That there is, like you said, moral agency, but that also means there's a possibility of moral metanoia, right? There's always the inbreaking that can change you from one way of being to another. It's not just circumstances.
Right. So I have to ask if you've read or heard of Barbara Robinson's The Greatest Christmas Pageant Ever.
Yes, of course. I've read it with my kids a few times, and then we went and saw it actually last year. We saw it performed by children, which was really fun.
Oh, that's so cool. Yeah. So I found this book one day on my parents' shelf. They had this big like book room in the back of the upstairs area, the back of the upstairs area of their house. And I would go through the books and just read whatever caught my attention. And this one caught my attention. So they had this, I still don't know why they had it. Maybe it was given to them, but I read it and it was just so moving. It was just like, wow, I didn't know anything about this author. I didn't know anything about the background or when it was published, I guess early 70s. But it's the real simple synopsis. It's the story of this church pageant that's being put on, and the main character, who sort of seems like autobiographical, but apparently is not, is involved with this church community, and she's very pious herself, like she believes, and she doesn't look very kindly on those who don't behave like church kids do, and that's the key to the story, because there's this family next door called the Herdmans, and nobody knows what the deal is with them, or if their dad exists. Their mom is sometimes around, apparently, but mostly they're just left at home alone, and they're doing ridiculous stuff like burning down sheds and torturing cats and trying to slam each other in this garage door as they run under. I thought that was the funniest part of the whole thing. But they're just a riot. They're like 6 of them or something, maybe 5. And these kids are not church kids. They're looked on as bad kids, but the story is how they get involved, looped in to the church pageant, and they're going to help put it on. And they even get cast as leading characters, like Imogene Herdman gets cast as Mary, the mother of Jesus. There was actually a New York Times obituary for Barbara Robinson back in, I guess, 2013. And this line really caught my attention. It just was so beautiful. And it explains exactly why this story has enduring appeal. They wrote, Imogene Herdman, the girl Godzilla, plays Mary in the Christmas pageant, and suddenly the audience sees what it must have been like for the real Holy Family, stuck away in a barn by people who didn't much care what happened to them. Hazel Rockman wrote in the New York Times in 1994 in a review of sequels to 3 popular children's novels from 1972. And then, in a scene so gentle that it's almost unbearable, awful old Imogene, her veil crookedy, the baby doll slung over her shoulder, hears Silent Night, and she cries and glimpses the mystery. No one can add to that. The bit about relating this back to the Holy Family themselves is interesting to me, because Jesus entered the circumstances of precisely the people who were looked down on by the powerful Scrooges of the world, right? The well-behaved church people of the world. And this gets back to that moral ambiguity we were talking about earlier, that the Herdmans didn't choose to be the way they are in the fullest sense, not in especially since they're children, not in the sort of fully culpable way, right? There were circumstances that led them to that. and the mercy of the gospel story and of these people who step into their lives actually radically reforms them. I want to invite you to help me understand where to draw that line and how to think well about people who we look at and we say, you're irredeemable, or you're going to ruin the Christmas pageant, right? Because we can't ruin every Christmas pageant and take that in all its metaphorical import. But we also have to be open to those miraculous moments of self understanding and revelation of the gospel story.
Yeah, the book is called The Best Christmas Pageant Ever because I think it tells the truth for the first time in that church, because the church had been so used to casting the same kids every year, and these were the powerful kids, the kids who have white privilege and finances and parents who take care of them and dress them nice, and they could practice their parts and do everything perfectly. And the truth of the Gospels is that God does not come to those who are perfect to make them more perfect and put them on stage. He comes to the ones who are broken and who are alone and who have nothing. And so when you see the Herdmans, when you see Imogene recognize herself in Mary, she sees something that everyone else missed, right? The reality of who Mary is, the reality of who Jesus is. It is the people without. As Howard Thurman says, Jesus came to those with their backs against the wall. He came to those people. And so that story ends up being the best Christmas pageant ever because it's the most truthful, embodied Christmas pageant ever. It's not the false piety. It's not the crazy, fake, romanticized Christian story. It's the real one.
There are a number of other stories we could talk about here, Jessica, and a lot of them are in the category of like children's cartoons that we know and love. So obviously we talked about the Grinch. Charlie Brown Christmas is one that I mentioned earlier. That's often been recognized as a sort of moral metanoia. There's Home Alone, where Kevin McAllister undergoes this transformation from hating his family to finally loving his family, and then alongside him, another transformation takes place with the neighbor that he meets at church, who he's always been afraid of with the snow shovel, and finally he persuades him to go and talk to his son and reconcile with him. And, he even finds refuge in church and so forth. But are there stories I'm missing, or are there things that you would highlight as well in the popular imagination that bring us to this spot of thinking about moral metanoia? And then I want to talk about how we can possibly use these to return the conversation to the Christmas story itself, to invite people to consider why it is they find these stories so appealing and powerful.
That's great. I mean, I think there's a ton. I think we always have to just look to see whether they're telling the truth. So my daughter, for example, was just in a play, and it was called An Enchanted Bookshop Christmas. And at one point, one of the characters says, if you just believe in yourself, everything is going to work out. And so my daughter at 9 was just like, other than that one lie, the play's pretty good. And I thought, I'm so glad you can catch that. I think we have to be discerning when we watch these things about whether they're telling the truth, because the truth of the story is that it's a grace that's given to us in Jesus Christ. It's not something we've earned or we believed hard enough in ourselves, and then God is going to be made human being or something, or the good things are going to happen to us. And so when we watch these stories, we need to watch for the truth that we've already talked about, that there is darkness, there is despair, that is how things start. It is the fall. That's the scriptural story. And things go down first before they ever get better, right? You have to get, like you said, you have to go all the way from watching Scrooge or watching Bailey, go down first, and then be risen up by revelation, by gift, by grace. And if that's the true arc of the story, then almost any story can tell the truth in that formula, as long as it doesn't break that and try to say that like everything is going well and things just got better, or things are always going to be good, or if you just believe in yourself, everything's going to be given to you. I think we just have to look through these Christmas stories and see which truth they're telling.
What's your typical approach when you want to talk to someone who's really inspired by a story that doesn't explicitly mention Jesus, but works along the contours of truth, goodness, and beauty that you're talking about? How do you keep from being super youth pastory and cheesy and just like, well, you know who else saved the people of his town? Or do you know who else knows how to keep Christmas in his heart? Or do you know who else isn't a Grinch or whatever? How do you walk that fine line?
Well, what I love about it, I think I'm just passionate about the reality of it. To me, it's not a moralistic imperative that we're taught in these stories. It's like I get to fall in love again. Like when you first fall in love with somebody, you can't stop talking about everything you remember about them or everything you see them in, or if they would like this or not like this, or you just can't stop talking. And that's kind of how I feel when I see Jesus in stories. When I see Jesus in a novel or in a film, I can't help but say, like, that's just written into the whole world. And so it's written into this story. Isn't that amazing? Like that because we are in his image, we're going to create these true stories that even if we haven't recognized where he is, we have this glimpse, we have this shadow of who he is. And then let me show you where the light's coming from, right? You just did this shadow on the wall. Can I show you the source of the light? Because it's amazing that you just did that because you're made in his image and you were able to tell this true story. So I think it's more of an excitement thing versus like, let me tell you how to be or how to love Jesus or how to find him. I think just showing people that he's there is a fun conversation and it's exciting because it's true.
I do want to ask about this as we get near the end of our time here, because I know that there are a lot of really good, redeeming, moral metanoia Christmas stories, but it seems to me that there are also probably some morally or spiritually dangerous Christmas stories, movies, cultural icons. And the reason I say dangerous is because they don't exalt truths because they're true. They exalt morals because they want them to be true. So I'm thinking especially of the whole like Santa Claus industrial complex. I go back and forth on something like Miracle on 34th Street, for instance, because that one's a tough one to talk about. But there seems to be this, like especially with Polar Express or something like that, there seems to be this idea that it doesn't really matter what you believe in or whether it's true in an objective sense, so long as you believe in it really hard, then it becomes true for you. And that gets pinned onto or associated with Christmas. Do you think there are some bad stories out there? And if so, how do we recognize them and avoid them?
I think we do have to have conversations about them. Miracle on 34th Street is a tough one because you only prove the truth, right? It has to be verified. You have to have verifiable ways of proving the truth. And so the whole court scene, it proves the truth of something. It proves the truth of what you believe in. But I think Polar Express is a little different because it's not about proving the truth. Like, can you still hear the bell when no one else can? And so I kind of go back and forth about what do you believe that's true and how do you know it's true? Do you have to have empirical evidence to make things true or not? To me, things are true if they're poetically true, right? Someone cannot say it's true that I love my daughter or not. You don't want to verify that. Don't prove that. I can just tell you that's true, that I love my daughter. And so there are some things that we have to recognize in these films. Are they showing us, especially when it comes to like belief in Santa or whatever, a lot of that ends up paralleling the belief in God, right? Just by analogy. And if you think that the belief in God has to be proved in a courtroom, or is it something that you can prove because you love it? Can you prove it through the story that you tell and how the story is true? Can you prove it in ways that are different than the scientific method? And is the film showing you that there's ways of proving things to believe in that are true outside of those methods?
Yeah, that's why I go back and forth on it. Because on the one hand, I totally get the critique. And this pastor friend of mine gave the full-throated critique of it, where he's just like, it's telling you that if you just believe in something hard enough, it doesn't matter whether it's true. And I get that. But then I also get the fact that they're portraying a farce. It's like the Scopes trial for Santa. You can't put God on trial. You can't put, and Santa is, standing in for God there. It's a sort of supernatural entity in which this child is deeply convinced. And the stupid, obnoxious lawyer figures are trying to disprove him. And that's a misguided way of going about it. You can't put God on trial. You can't put truth, goodness, and beauty on trial. And that's not to say that they're true because we believe in them. No, we believe in them because they're true. So I call this the Puddleglum effect, where I heard someone actually try to like take apart the silver chair and say, Lewis is saying there that it doesn't matter whether Aslan and Narnia and the sky and the sun are real. It's just that Puddleglum believed really hard, and so it's real for him. And I was like, how do you miss the point of a story so badly? It's no. The point is that he's saying Puddleglum's desires are for a real thing, just like in Mere Christianity. If I find in my heart a desire if I find in myself a desire nothing in the world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. And that's to me, that's what we find in a lot of these stories, which is why I want to be cautious in condemning them, because there is truth in the idea that our desires and our sense of beauty do lead us to what's true. And that's part of also why I'm not immediately hostile to stories that don't mention Jesus explicitly.
Well, and neither am I. I am hostile to stories that teach lies. I mean, I think that's the thing you have to get at is, for me, it doesn't matter whether it's teaching Jesus explicitly or accidentally or implicitly. It's when it lies and says, like, you are your own God, or you can do it yourself, or you just believe in yourself. I mean, those kind of things I think are the most harmful stories we can tell. Or if you believe hard enough, you're going to get the material possession that you wanted. Though I think that's something else that happens at Christmas, is the fallacy of, like, if you just really believe you're going to get rollerblades, you're going to get rollerblades. And that kind of gift giving is the wrong kind of spirit to have with Christmas. So if those stories are being told, that's not truth. That there's nothing about that parallels what is being told in the scripture. And it has to parallel what is being told in the scripture or is written in the nature of the world in order to tell the truth.
Okay, so no more singing Jolly Old Saint Nicholas. You can't whisper into his ear what you really want this Christmas and expect it to happen. That's not.
You know what? Actually, it's why. It's why I loved the newer Grinch. I love the Grinch story in general, but with the film adaptation, the cartoon one with Benedict Cumberbatch that came out just a few years ago.
I've not seen that.
Okay, well, one of the things I like about it is the little girl does not wish for rollerblades or anything like that. She wants to make her mom happy. She has a single mom, and that, the Cindy Lou character in this one, her mom is single. And she just feels like her mom gives and gives and gives, and someone should give to her mom for a change. And so there's this, reciprocal gratitude that happens. That instead, what happens, instead of making her mom happy, she pays it forward and gives her gratitude to the Grinch and invites him to their dinner. And that's actually a true story about what grace is supposed to do when you receive selfless love, like Cindy Lou does from her mother. She doesn't have to pay her mother back with a present. She has to pay it forward to the Grinch and invite him into that kind of love. And so, I think that story ends up telling more of a truth.
So last question here. Your ability to perceive a lot of these themes and to work through them and just like figure out what we can and can't take, and then what corresponds in a meaningful way to Christian truth is very helpful. How can we be better listeners and readers and viewers when it comes to themes like these? What is it that you look for when you turn on a movie or you open a novel and you think there are going to be truths and there are going to be lies in here? And whether it's Christmas themed or not, I want to be alert to those. What are some of the questions you're asking yourself?
Okay, so the very short answer that's going to sound self-promotional, I'm sorry, but I really did write the book because I was trying to answer this question for people. I wrote a book that comes out in March called Reading for the Love of God. And so it's essentially like, how do you read films? How do you read books? How do you read the world for the love of God, with the end of like loving God with the culture you're taking in? How does that happen? Like, how do you do that? So the exact question you're asking, I would say that that's the short answer. The longer version would be really being well-versed in scripture. I grew up in a Christian tradition that was know your Bible, know it by heart, have it written on your heart so that when you're watching a movie, you know the scriptures. And I think that if you get too far away from reading scripture regularly, you might start believing in a Jesus that looks a lot more like you than it does the Jesus that's in the Bible. And then that means when you read films, you become your own standard and your own rubric. And so then if it pleases you, then it must be pleasing God. And there becomes some scary ways of reading and watching films there. So I think the antidote to that is to be well versed in scripture that gives you a different lens by which to perceive films and books.
What's your biggest alarm bell when something is leading you in a dark direction or a deceptive direction? And what's your biggest, I just had to add this addendum on, and then what's your biggest like two thumbs way up sort of, wow, this is telling me the truth signal in a story?
Oh, good. Okay, the biggest warning to me is if it says that I am my own person, I write my own story, I'm in charge of myself, believe in myself. That to me is just always the biggest alarm bell. You do you is the biggest alarm bell. Because it's going to sound extreme to say it, but it's satanic. It's what Satan said is, I shall have no other God but myself. And we just have to be very, very scared of any form of that in films or books. My greatest two thumbs way up is self-sacrifice. And a lot of our recent films and books are trying to take away self-sacrifice. No one can die for another person because life is the greatest gift you have, which that is true. And therefore, because there's nothing that comes after it, the idea of self-sacrifice makes no sense in films and books anymore. Like, how dare you lay down your life like you've lost everything? There's no sense of an eternal or resurrection or redemption, and it's worthless. That was meaningless. And so we've detracted everything from it. So if you see a film that does self-sacrifice well, that to me is a beautiful film. Because that's what Jesus does as he lays down his life. So any film that still uplifts and upholds the idea that you could lay down your life for somebody else is gorgeous.
That's so great. My guest today has been Jessica Hooten-Wilson, author and scholar of liberal arts at Pepperdine University. Jessica, thanks so much for having this conversation on Upstream. I've really enjoyed it. And Merry Christmas to you.
Yeah, thank you, Shane. Merry Christmas to you.
Upstream is a program of the Colson Center. When it comes to the hardest questions we ask, we have thousands of years of accumulated wisdom from which to draw, from a faith that is the explanation of all reality. So come upstream and learn to understand the world, the church, and the God who has placed you in them. Connect with us on social media or find more resources at upstream.colsoncenter.org.